Welcome to the Smooth Finish, the podcast of the National Plasters Council. Before we dive in, we would like to remind our listeners that the views and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the NPC. While we encourage a variety of perspectives to foster industry discussion, the NPC remains committed to its established standards and guidelines.
Welcome, baby. The NPC presents Smooth Finish with our hosts Rob Romano, Chris Marcano, and Brent Lane. These guys have more chemistry than your entire test kit, ever enlightening and striving to be entertaining. So let's dive into their latest episode of the NPC's Smooth Finish.
All right, thank you everyone for tuning in today for the latest Smooth Finish, and this one is an absolute very important episode. We are joined with one of the leading experts on all things when it comes to aquatic consulting. John McIntyre is gracing us with his presence today. Welcome, John.
Thanks.
So if you're watching, you will just notice that it's just John and I today. My other two esteemed colleagues, Brent and Rob, are unable to make this one. But don't worry, we are still here with Jimmy, the Superfly Sewell producer, and he's pushing the buttons behind the scenes. And today we are going to talk about what seems to be the hottest topic in the industry, and that is ASR, or alkalized silica reaction. So before we get into that, though, let's talk a little bit about our guest, John McIntyre. He is with McIntyre & McIntyre Incorporated out of Austin, Texas, which is an architecture and engineering consulting firm that specializes in aquatic consulting. I know he's worked with a lot of the other entities in our industry, including the PHTA as well as now the MPC. And John, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you've got at least 4 decades of experience under your belt there in this world.
More than that, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. I didn't want to date you there. So when we wanted to share some insight on this phenomenon that's happening, right? This issue that's going out there, ASR, we really wanted to do our diligence and bring kind of the tip of the spear, or the top of the pyramid when it comes to expertise. So that's why we went out and found John, and he came highly, highly recommended from a lot of people. So we're really excited to get into this. So without further ado, let's get into this. And John, if you don't mind, if you could just kind of give from your perspective a description and help the listeners out there understand exactly what is ASR.
Well, in the short version, ASR is a reaction between the alkalize in the cement, the reactive minerals in the aggregates, and water that forms a gel on the inside, an expansive gel on the inside of the concrete matrix, mm-hmm. and it splits the concrete from the inside out, kind of like a soda can would, when you put it in the freezer, would expand and burst from expanding ice.
Okay. So essentially, this is something that develops, and then is it dependent on temperature that it starts to really be destructive, or what's the factor of temperature there?
It does accelerate with temperature, so you will see it in spas a little bit more accelerated than in a pool, but it can occur. I mean, we see it in pools down here all the time. Mm-hmm. It's kind of exploded in the Central Texas area.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where,
to that
where
point,
all of this started was back in about 2016, 2017, when EPA shut down the coal-fired electric generation plants. Fly ash was a byproduct of that coal burning, and fly ash was the most common addition to the cement mixture to negate ASR. Fly ash has several benefits, and it's been used for a long time, and was very commonly added to most mixtures. It makes when I say concrete, gunite, shotcrete, concrete are all basically the same thing. It's just how they're applied. The mm-hmm. gunite and shotcrete is pneumatically applied. concrete can be, poured out of the back of a truck or pumped. But it's all has the same components in it. The fly ash occupies the pore space. So let me back up a little bit. When the concrete is first curing, concrete doesn't dry; it cures, and it grows little crystals inside the matrix there. If you remember back from when you were a kid and you got a glass of water and dumped a whole bunch of sugar in it and warmed it up so it would dissolve, and you dropped a string with a stick on the top, and little crystals would grow on it. You made a little candy. Yeah. That all grows together, and all those little fingers interlock, and that's what gives concrete the strength and ties it all together, and keeps it bound. If you didn't have that, it would just fall apart. It would stay like sand and just collapse into a pile. So you need the water early on to hydrate the concrete, grow those crystals, get the concrete up to strength. That requires a certain amount of water. That's where the water-cement ratio comes from in concrete, which is about 0.43, that will give you full hydration. If you put too much water in concrete, you're going to have water left over after the reaction is fully cured. Then that can go into the formation of ASR, for one, among other things, and can lead to more porous concrete, all sorts of other things in there. So you really don't want to add excess water to the mix. Now, of course, in a pool, you've got the added benefit that you fill the whole thing up with water.
Right.
Plaster, as we know, is watertight, but it's not waterproof. Vapor gets through. In other words, flowing water won't go through it unless it's cracked, but water vapor will. You only need about 80% relative humidity to keep the ASR reaction going. So it doesn't require a whole lot of moisture. So one of the things you look for is the ways to keep the water out of the mix. One of those is by adding fly ash, because the fly ash particles are much smaller than the cement. They occupy these spaces. They actually can grow just a little bit, but not excessively, and will prevent water from getting into the mix. Additionally, they react with the hydroxide ions in the cement and will reduce the pH of the overall mixture. ASR requires a pH of about 12 to start working. Curing concrete without fly ash in it will give you about a 12.8 pH. So that's where part of that comes from. So it has two effects. It prevents the water from reaching it to make the mixture, and it lowers the pH. So that was the prime addition. It was readily available. It was cheap. Everybody used it. Then all of a sudden, EPA shuts everything down. We go to the natural gas fired, to wind and solar. All of a sudden, it's hard to get fly ash. So what happened, and this happened in 2016-ish. So about 2016, 2017, a lot of the manufacturers were not including fly ash in their mixtures. And they thought, well, we'll just, it was in there, but it's a pozzolan. It adds a little to the strength, but we'll just go back to straight Portland cement. And they had forgotten about, because it's been so long since ASR was an issue. I mean, it was discovered back in the late 20s, early 30s, somewhere in there.
Really?
So it's been known for a long time, but it just hasn't been a problem. You never heard people talking about it.
So it was known, John, in other circles in time, but it just basically got lost in time.
That's right.
Okay.
So what happened was, then all of a sudden, fast forward about 3 years, because ASR is a slow process to develop, and around 2019, 2020, we started seeing the first cases of that. Mm-hmm. The first ones, you go look at it, you see some cracking, you think, oh, well, there's cracks, and pools can get cracks for a variety of reasons. And so you go fix it. And a few months later, you got more cracks. You fix those, a few months later, you got more cracks. So it wasn't until about late 2020, maybe early 21, people realized, hey, there's something going on here that's a lot more widespread than just a few cracks in random pools. And that's kind of when all this blew up, and it just started appearing everywhere.
Wow. Okay, so that's where we're at now. So that's really good information too, that it sounds like typically it can take up to 3 years before the reaction really starts to become symptomatic.
Typically, and it depends on the reactivity of the aggregate. There's 4 different classes from R0 to R3. R0 being it's not going to do anything. R3 means you might want to find another source.
Right.
R1 and R2 are easily modified with the addition of fly ash, or there are some other materials you can put in as well. The R3, you can mitigate it, but you're taking a bigger risk. So it varies a lot with the materials. But just the other day, I received word of one and some pictures, and it's certain that the test results have not come back yet. But all the visual indications are it's ASR, and it was barely over a year from construction, which is by far the earliest I have seen. Most of the ones I've seen, it takes 2.5, 3 years to really start noticing the cracking.
Great information. John, could you elaborate a little bit too? I know we talked earlier, kind of preempting this conversation, but would you explain a little bit the difference between ASR and the alkali carbonate reaction, or ACR?
Yeah, they're both, and actually ASR is a type of ACR. It's alkaline carbonate. It's more the reaction with the limestones, and it is very seldom seen. It's really not that big of an issue. You very rarely hear of ACR. Mostly you hear of ASR. Mm-hmm. And that's because the rocks here in central Texas are a lot of the cherts, quartz, opal, things like that have a high silicon dioxide content in them. And that silicon is what reacts with the hydroxides in the cement and forms the gel that expands and causes the ASR.
Okay. That's great to know. All right. So we've kind of put a spotlight on what ASR is and the time frame and essentially what it kind of looks like. And essentially it's systemic breakdown and cracking, right? I mean, essentially, and you start to see it within the surface of the pool and on the exterior as well. But let's talk about what ASR really means to the pool industry in your perspective. Like, what are the unique risks that ASR poses to the structures compared to other things too out there? Like, I mean, what is unique about ASR occurring in a pool as opposed to a bridge or a garage floor?
Well, ASR can occur in any of those and does. I've seen it in several foundations. Now, when you get to a house foundation, of course, you typically put polyethylene down as a vapor barrier first, so you're insulated from moisture in the ground, at least to some extent. Right. Then on the upper side of the slab, you have a house that's typically air conditioned and climate controlled, and your humidity is probably in the range of 50% somewhere. So you're not getting the excess moisture from inside the house. So while you can get it in house foundations, you just don't see it that often because they're not as wet, and you don't have the moisture to do that. Additionally, you cover the floors with, carpet, wood, vinyl, whatever. You can take me to any 10 houses in town here, and I will find you cracks in the slab. Now, a lot of those, granted, are shrinkage cracks, and other things. Sure. Some of those could be ASR cracks, but without enough water, because water is one of the 3 components you have to make the reaction progress. Without water, it doesn't happen, or it only happens to a very minor degree. So you don't see it much. But I have seen a couple, as a matter of fact, I was out by a couple of the lake houses out here outside of town, and they were down by close to the shoreline, and the soil was quite moist. And in the garage, you could see the little white beads popping up, in the floor there. So it can happen there. Now, it also happens on bridges, abutments, columns, things that are outside that are exposed to the rain. TxDOT has done a lot of research into ASR. Interestingly, one of the things they have found on a lot of the outside exposures like that, because your only exposure is due to rain. I mean, if you got a bridge beam column above, it is exposed to rain. That's about it. They have found that the ASR, when it starts, will start from the outside, go in several inches, and then it seems to kind of play out. That's about as far in as it progresses. Not in every case, but in a lot of them. And they have found that then they can just chip that part off, because pretty much at that point you're outside of all the structural steel, and then they can recoat it with some other, cement that's properly waterproofed and protects the structure. So, but there is a lot of ASR in outside structures like that. So It's not limited to pools. It's just pools, you have such a readily available water source to feed the reaction on a 24/7 basis. It kind of puts everything else to shame, so to speak.
Sure. It sounds like, so basically, to sum it up, we've got the perfect scenario where the planets are completely aligned for all the wrong reasons to make the pool scenario with ASR as extreme as it can be, as opposed to a foundation or a bridge or something of that sort.
Yeah, that's true.
That's, well, lucky us, right? Here we are.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like famous or infamous, depending on your point of view.
Yeah, exactly. So on that note, though, John, could you also explain kind of some of the factors that make pools particularly vulnerable to ASR? I mean, obviously, water is a big one, right? So could you kind of expand that out a little bit as we keep going?
Water is a big one. And, of course, on in-ground pools, you've got the pool down in the ground. There's moisture in the ground. Now, here in Texas, it gets pretty dry during the summer, down to, at least 5 or 6 feet. So you may not get much reaction during the summer. However, during the winter, when it's cooler and you get more rain and the evaporation is a lot slower, the ground stays moist. So you can get ASR progressing from the outside inward, as well as from the interior of the pool going outward. When we've done core testing on pools, we have found fairly consistently on in-ground pools that you have ASR formation near the inside and near the outside faces of the pool shell. So that is not uncommon, and that makes it, unlike some of the other situations where you get it from one side only, this, on a pool, you can get it from both sides working to the interior.
Interesting. So as far as the outbreak, there's a lot of kind of misnomers and misinformation that's floating out there about this. And I do want to stress, it's when you look at the big picture and the kind of the boom that we saw post-COVID and the record amount of pools that were put into the ground over the last 4 or 5 years, this is relatively it's not a widespread problem per se when you look at the map entirety of North America. However, I think it's very fair and safe to say that this is, depending on certain geographic locations, this is a legitimate problem, and it's happening at too high of a frequency for anybody's taste. So I know, John, we've talked about it, and primarily I've heard a lot of Texas, and even I thought this was exclusively a Texas problem, but there has been pockets in other areas, right? Like Washington, different areas of Texas, and even a little bit in California, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. It's not limited just to Texas. And I think even up in the north central U.S., I want to say Minnesota or up in there, around in there somewhere, there's been some cases of it. So, yeah, it's not limited just to one. Here in Texas is by far the worst, the most number of cases and stuff. I mean, we've got one big multi-district litigation going on that has, and that's where they've combined several counties worth of cases into one jurisdiction so one judge can rule on it.
Right.
It's kind of like a class action for defense. So rather than defending the same case 360 times, you do it once and you apply it to all the cases. But just in this one case, there's last count, there was over 360 defendants, or plaintiffs, I should say, in the case. And that's one of several cases.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's
one other thing I forgot to mention earlier too.
Yeah.
One of the things to look out for on this, the ASR outbreak seems to be confined almost exclusively, not completely, but almost exclusively to wet shotcrete, as opposed to gunite being dry shotcrete. And of course, the dry shotcrete, the materials come down the tube dry, they're mixed with water and air at the nozzle and then sprayed out. So the nozzleman controls a lot of the mixture and the amount of water. And as we mentioned earlier, that has a lot to do with the porosity of the mixture. If you go, I think I was mentioning before, a 0.43 water to cement ratio is really what you want for optimum hydration. If you increase that amount just 2% to a 0.45 water cement ratio, you've increased your porosity 10 times. If you increase it from 0.43 to 0.47, you can increase it as much as the porosity as much as 100 times, which, I mean, you're getting to a sponge consistency there. And where this becomes a problem in Texas, when it gets so hot and the concrete tends to flash quickly and dry quickly and get stiff, the workers want more water added to the mixture so that it stays more workable longer and it's easier to, finish it and strike it off and all. Mm-hmm. The problem is you're adding too much water to the mixture, and that adversely affects the durability of your final product. And of course, once you get any little hairline crack in a plaster, then you've got an avenue for water to get into the matrix and spread a lot faster. So what you should be doing there is using water reducing admixtures, plasticizers, and things like that to make the mixture more workable, but not add more water to it. But
gotcha.
Gunite has, just in very simple terms, has basically sand and cement. There's a few other components, but those are the major ones. Wet, and that's dry shotcrete, is commonly called gunite. Wet shotcrete, what everybody calls shotcrete, has sand, cement, and pebbles. And the advantage to it is that it is sent down the pipes wet. It's mixed in the truck, like a typical cement truck, mm-hmm. put into the hopper, pressure down the chute, and then air is, it's shot out of the nozzle with air. You get a more consistently uniform mixture with shotcrete. So on large chutes like commercial pools and things, they would much rather have shotcrete than gunite. Also with gunite, it's just so fine a spray, you get a lot of what's called rebound. That's where the sand coming out bounces off the walls of the forms, mm-hmm. falls back on the floor. It's basically sand with most of the paste, the cement paste, knocked off of it. You're not supposed to, under any circumstances, reuse that. You're supposed to shovel it out of the pool and toss it, because there's not enough binder left to make it sound. Also, when you are shooting shotcrete, whether gunite or shotcrete, it's coming out of that nozzle at about 70, 80 miles an hour. So when you're shooting it on itself, it compacts itself into the existing material, and it's self-consolidated. You don't have to vibrate it, rot it, and all that stuff like you do typical sheet concrete. Mm-hmm. But you get a lot more. Gunite's a little cheaper, but you have more waste. You'll probably have 10, 12% waste on it. Shotcrete costs a little more, but you don't get that rebound because you've got the larger stones. Right. So you don't have as much waste. So they end up coming out, pretty much the same cost-wise. But as I mentioned, with shotcrete, what's nice about it, it tends to be a little bit more consistent because you don't have somebody up in the nozzle constantly adjusting it. So for larger pools, it's great. For resident, either one is fine done properly, but there's a lot more variation in gunite than there is in shotcrete. See, I think what were we talking about? I got off on that rant there.
We were talking about just the geographic areas that it was happening in and occurring. And, it's shown up in pockets in a few other places besides Texas, which is a great segue, actually, because I wanted to kind of drill in a little bit and understand is the reason that it is primarily, when you look at all the cases, where still the lion's share seem to be in the municipal areas of the state of Texas. Can we trace that back to the fly ash situation, or is it a climate situation, or
to the lack of fly ash because of the reactive aggregate in the quarries around here? The Colorado River runs through town, and it's dammed to form a whole series of lakes as it goes through Austin. Mm-hmm. As you exit Austin and head out towards Houston, between Austin and Bastrop, there's a whole series of quarries along the Colorado River there. There are a number of these where the materials have come from that have caused problems. So you've got to be careful, what you do. You want to have your materials tested which is not an absolute. It lowers your probabilities, but a lot of those tests have fairly high error rates in them. But you want to make sure that you're adding something like, a fly ash, a pozzolan. Furnace slag is basically the same thing from steel smelting. You can use lithium salts. There's other products you can put in, but fly ash was the cheapest and most readily available. The other products start to get more expensive as you go down the line. That being said, a given quarry can have good parts and bad parts. You can hit a vein of active material. I mean, all this sand and pebbles were deposited by floods over the millennia, leading up to the point that we started digging it out. And it didn't happen in one flood. It happened in a whole bunch of them. So as these different deposits came down, they came from different areas upstream, wherever the rainfall was the worst, and flooded that area out. So you can have veins running through the quarries that have good and bad, as far as reactivity, have good and bad material in even a given quarry, even in layers of a quarry. So just because, and this is one of the things that makes it hard to counteract some of it without making sure you're adding the proper additives, is you could have been getting material from this quarry for several years, never had a problem, and all of a sudden, boom, the next load you've got a problem.
Right.
So it can vary over very short distances.
Yeah. What a challenge, right? What a challenge. So I can only imagine what's going on with some of these pool builders and contractors. So let's shift gears a little bit and focus on that perspective, if you don't mind. When it comes to pool builders and contractors out there that are potentially, dealing with possibilities of this occurring and navigating the climate right now, like, what can we look for? Like, what are the signs of ASR typically? So if somebody's out there and they want to know more and they want to be proactive, like, walk us through what they should be looking for. We already, we talked about typically it can be anywhere from a year to 3 years, but let's start from the beginning and we're walking up to a pool. What are we looking for, John?
Sure. Well, one of the most obvious signs is what they call the map, alligator, or spiderweb cracking, where you've got random cracking just running all over the surface. Now, that doesn't just go poof one day, it's there. It'll start with probably a crack, then it will morph into several others. If you have continued cracking like that, then you want to start looking at it. If you start seeing either efflorescence or kind of an amber color substance coming out from those cracks, then you want to take a serious look at that. If you've got a crack, and you don't always get alligator cracking, but that's the most obvious manifestation of it. If you've got a crack that you repair, and a couple months later you get another crack, not too far away. Mm-hmm. You repair that. A couple months later you get another crack. You just can't keep ahead of the crack repair. That would be an indication that there was something like ASR going on, rather than something like a settlement crack or a shrinkage crack or something like that. I mean, there's lots of things that cause cracks in pools, and we've dealt with those, and you can repair them, and it's not that big a deal. ASR, though, once it permeates through the shell of the pool, pretty much you're stuck with a removal and replacement. There's no good repairs to it if you've got an established case of this. What we were saying was the most obvious outward sign is this spiderweb cracking all over. And I've gotten there's a lot of misinformation floating around out there.
Oh, absolutely.
I have had people call me within 6 months and say, hey, I've got a crack in my pool. I think I've got ASR. And I'm like, no, that's way too early. It's not a quick forming process. It's a very slow accumulation. Once you get the initial crack started, it can accelerate because you get all these avenues now to get water inside the concrete. But the initial exposures tend to be, in most cases, 2.5 to 3 years. This all depends on the reactivity of the aggregate. If you've got a lesser reactive, it can take 5, even 10 years sometimes to show up. But in a few, very, very few cases, I've heard it being less, and I can count them on less than one hand, being less than 2 years. I think I mentioned one to you that it was, just slightly over a year. It's certainly, the test results have not come back, but it's certainly from all the outward appearances looks like ASR. But that would be by far and away the fastest one that I have ever seen.
So 2.5 to 3 years is kind of that
pretty typical.
The typical time frame to really start showing this map cracking. Now, you mentioned some discoloration. What's from the cracks? What's the cause of that? Is that a rebar issue or?
Well, no. You can have rusting if you get a crack in there and water gets to the rebar and it rusts, and you'll get a kind of a reddish brown stain. But a lot of times, what you will see is, first off, you'll see the efflorescence, that white staining, which is the calcium chloride, which is the water soluble part of the lime in concrete that will then be delivered out to the surface. As water evaporates from the surface, it leaves the calcium carbonate, and that's what you're seeing. It will also accumulate on the insides if you got water pressure from the outside trying to force the moisture towards the inside of the pool. It'll show on the inside as well. You can also get a little amber or honey-colored material on there. It can be sometimes very thick, not syrupy isn't right. It's thicker than that. It's almost, I don't know, anyway, like a very, very, very thick syrup, almost to the point of a solid, but not quite. That is
like a tar almost?
Yeah, and even thicker than that probably.
Okay.
That is the actual gel, the reactive gel that's formed. That stuff with water, when the reaction occurs, it absorbs water and swells. That's what causes the cracking. It's like putting a wedge inside the concrete and forcing it apart.
Interesting.
Think of hydraulic cracking from the inside out.
So it can swell so much it will actually exude out. It will permeate out. Interesting. Wow. If
you go Google some of the TxDOT photos on ASR, you can look at some of their retaining walls, and I mean it is. There's not a piece that big that's not cracked, and you'll see this amber gel, oozing out around it, and it's that's extreme cases, of course. I have only seen a couple of the pools that actually have the actual amber gel coming out. Most of them, you're seeing the white efflorescence, if even that. It may be just the cracks.
It might be just the map cracking or the Spiderweb cracking.
Yeah.
Interesting. So that's really good information. So let's talk. You mentioned kind of the extreme case there, and let's just address it. Like, what if a pool builder is dealing with one of these kind of quote unquote nightmare scenarios, and everything's left untreated? Like, what does that look like? I mean, let's just be completely honest here and transparent with folks.
Well, I mean, if you've got a good exposure of mass cracking on the side of spiderweb cracking, your options are pretty thin. All of the in-place options that I'm aware of right now are Band-Aids. They will extend the life of your pool somewhat. To what degree, it's not known really, because most of these have not been tried long enough to know how long they're going to last. Are they good for a year, for 5 years, 10 years? We don't know yet because they haven't been in place long enough to test them that long. But there are things like coatings you can put on there. I know the big chemical companies like Miracoat, Laticrete, Sitka have a 3-part coating you can put on with an isolation membrane. Some of those have been done here, and it depends on the stage of your ASR development. If it's early and it's not cracked much, those seem to last longer. Some of those have been in place like 5.5 years and not recracked. Others have recracked in about 1.5 to 2 years, so that the cracking was just more than the material could absorb in its flexure. You can look at things like putting a vinyl liner on the inside. Now, what I've heard several people mention is most vinyl liners are less than 30 mils thick, and because of the rough surface of the cracking and the general temperature movement and things of the pool, they can abrade and wear out in several years' time. What some people are using is like a stock tank liner or a rubber roofing membrane, like TPO or PVC, and getting a 60 mil sheet. So you're getting a little thickness to it. Those seam welded together. You put them in, cut them, fit them to the shape of the pool. It's not going to feel like a gunite pool anymore. It's going to feel like a vinyl liner. But, and we'll probably get to this in a minute, but the cost of removal is not cheap, and replacement is not cheap.
No.
And if you don't have the resources nor the insurance coverage to help you out with that, these could be options that you could look at. Now, how long will those last? Well, nobody knows because they haven't been in long enough to get to a failure point to know that they're good for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I would think something like a good thick rubber liner like that would probably last a little bit longer and certainly give you some durability. It's going to be a lot cheaper than removing and replacing the pool. So if you don't have other options, that's certainly one to look at. One I do not advise looking at is spraying fiberglass on the face of the existing shell. I know several people have done that. It has not lasted. Within a year and a half or so, they crack, and it's not a cheap process. You're spending quite a bit of money to do that, and it doesn't last. In my mind, it's not time-wise, it's not worth the investment.
Right.
The other things you can look at is doing another shell inside of a shell. So you use the existing pool as a form, cast a new, you want to put a bond breaker of some sort in there first, whether it's a rubber sheet or something, so that the cracks from the old don't translate into the new. Mm-hmm. You've, of course, got to extend all your pipes, and you need to be careful to provide a little space around those pipes, because if those two shells move differentially, you can crack the pipes. Okay, so it doesn't work in every instance. You have to have someone who's familiar with this to look at it and see if it'll work. The other problem you get into is if you've got a tan shelf that, say, only has 4 inches of water, and you're now going to spray a new 6 to 8 inch shell inside of the old one, all of a sudden your tan shelf is out of water. You don't have one. Well, then what do? Well, you can raise the side. There's no code that says your coping has to be flush with the deck, and some pools are on purpose built with kind of a seat ledge around the outside, kind of like a spa, so you can sit down, swing your legs in, jump in. So you might look at doing the edge. So these are things you've got to look at and make some decisions on an individual basis of, does it make sense for our pool or doesn't it? It may or may not.
So depending on the severity of the case, there are some, for lack of a better term, some Band-Aid solutions that can be done. And, hopefully we've got some of the manufacturers out there in the industry that are looking through innovation to find a longer term solution, obviously. But right now we do have some things that can be done within the industry on a case by case basis.
And there's some things being developed that are not on the market yet, that are still being tested, that may or may not come to fruition, that may be able to treat existing shells in place. I've heard some of this through the grapevine, but haven't been able to get it confirmed through the manufacturers. They're all playing very hush-hush because they don't want to lose the market.
Understood.
But there could be one of the advantages to try, if you don't have other options, to try and make your pool last a little longer, is there in a couple of years there may be some treatments available that are not on the market now. Can't promise that, but it's a possibility.
Well, that's a natural conclusion. I think that there's going to be opportunity for these manufacturers to offer some benefit added products for this particular problem. On the next step on this ladder is how, we've talked about what ASR is. We've talked about kind of the history of it and how to identify it and then kind of what you can do if you have it. But let's talk about prevention and really the mitigation of it. Are there any practical steps that you can take to prevent this? I know it's probably a little bit of a long shot, knowing now what you've educated us on, but what can pool builders do out there to kind of minimize risk?
Well, the first thing we've already touched on is right now, I would recommend it, since fly ash is hard to get a hold. As a matter of fact, the one plant that makes type F fly ash in Texas is down because of an accident in their yard not long ago. So all the fly ash in the state, from my understanding of talking to suppliers, is being imported from foreign sources. So that makes it a little more expensive.
Sure. There's going to be a cost element to that. Sure. Yeah.
But one of the first things is look at using gunite, dry process shotcrete, rather than wet shotcrete. Because although it's not a zero probability, it is extremely low that you're going to get any ASR problems with or without fly ash in it, using the dry process gunite. Wet process seems to be where the problems are. And that's because the pebbles, the reaction occurs on the surface of the aggregate. The pebbles have so much more surface area compared to a grain of sand that it is much more reactive than the sand only mixture. So first thing, look at using just gunite if you at all can. If you're going to use shotcrete, make sure you put fly ash or one of the other supplementary cementitious materials, as they're called, like furnace slag or lithium, or there's several products coming on the market. Some people are mixing like Zypex, which is a waterproofing additive that can be mixed in with the mixture up front rather than applying it later on. Zypex can also be applied after the fact. They generally recommend, I think it's within 48 hours of application or of placement, and it'll absorb in a couple of inches into the concrete. I'm a little dubious on some of that, but if you can mix it in and get thorough mixing, and you want protection from both the outside and the inside, because as we mentioned, there's water in the ground as well as water in the pool, so you really need to protect both sides. So you want an integral mixture like that. The other thing is look at use good construction practices. Make sure you've got enough steel in your shell. It's been my experiences that most pool contractors have no clue why they're putting that much steel, in their shell. They're thinking, oh, it's a little more expensive, I'll put some more. It's a lot of monkey see, monkey do.
Right.
There are some ratios in the American Concrete Institute, the Building Code for Structural Concrete 318, that specifies you want at least 2% of the cross section in steel to control cracking. Now, control does not mean eliminate. It means you limit it to very fine cracks spread out over the surface of the material. In a house slab where you're covering it with carpet, vinyl, tile, whatever, that's not an issue. You don't see it. In a pool, you're applying plaster directly to it. Whatever the substrate does, the plaster is going to do. So if you get a crack in the gunite, it's going to translate through the plaster, because plaster is much weaker than gunite, and it's not considered to be a structural material. It's your water-resistant coating. So, make sure you've got the proper admixtures, the proper steel. Where I didn't get to was, if you look at the shotcrete guide, ACI 506, they recommend basically tripling that amount of 2% up to 0.6% to eliminate cracking during the curing process and during thermal expansion contraction. Pools will expand and contract about 3/4 of an inch per 100 degrees. Yeah. So if you've got your typical backyard pool is somewhere in the range of, say, 16 by 32, 33. That means you should expect that pool to grow and shrink 1/4 of an inch over the year during temperature changes. Extreme cold, extreme hot, you can get more of that. But you look at here in Texas, the last 3 years, which hardly ever happens, but it has for 3 years in a row, we've had extended freezes of multiple days. So the pools have a chance to really get cooled down much farther than they usually do. And in the summertime, of course, you're getting 110, 120 degrees outside. Yeah. It gets warm. Usual years here, we have a very narrow swing of temperatures, but the last several, we've had a lot bigger ones. And I've seen more calls on cracks, and some of them are from thermal cracking. So use good practices. Educate yourself. Get involved with, PHTA, with the American Shotcrete Association, the ACI, American Concrete Institute. Your guys, the Plasters Council. All of these people have good information that's readily available. Make yourself, avail yourself of that. Educate yourself on what you need to be doing to build it right. I know in Texas there's no licensing to contractors, so anybody with a pickup can declare themselves a pool builder. You need to really, as an owner and a potential pool customer, you need to look into those people closely, see what their history is, get some references and talk to them. and find out if they've had any problems. Have they had any ASR issues? Where are they getting their materials from? And do a little research. So, unfortunately, it's become somewhat of a buyer beware market right now.
Right.
It shouldn't be that way, but that's kind of the fact of life right now.
No, this has been invaluable information, John. And just to add one more note here, I know that John's been an active member of a new task force that's been created by the PHTA, our partners over there. So I'm really excited for you guys to keep progressing this. And we wanted to help spread that message and really shed some light and gain some insight. So this conversation has been absolutely invaluable, John. And I think this is a great spot to kind of summarize and wrap it up. But it sounds like this problem is a real thing. It's isolated, but it's not completely unique just to Texas.
Right.
And I think it's so fascinating that it really typically shows up between 2.5 to 3 years. It's great to understand what to exactly look for, what to do in the event that you are pretty certain that you do have this issue. And I think the biggest takeaway is to understand why this is occurring, which you've done such a good job of shedding some light on that. And also from a homeowner's perspective, understanding the questions to ask if you are looking at adding a swimming pool to your backyard and understanding, what this really looks like as a whole. So again, this has been a great conversation. Before we wrap it up, is there anything else you want to add, John, before we close this chapter?
I would say just, look at people for doing pools that are members of the recognized associations, who have kept up their continuing education, who have kept up with the trends and know what's going on. I mean, that's one of the most important things right now. Things in this whole industry are changing. One thing I should mention is that while some of the earlier cases, the insurance companies were trying to balk at payment, that has now turned around. There's been a couple rulings that have gone a little more in favor of the owners. And these insurance companies are now realizing that if they're going to take this to litigation, it's going to cost them a substantial amount of money to litigate it. Plus, they may be tagged for some damages on the back end anyway. And if that's true, it's getting to the point where they can sometimes fix these pools more cheaply than they go litigate it. And of course, they're going to do what's cheapest for them.
Sure.
So if they can work with the builder and get reasonable repairs, not big fluffed up. We've seen some proposals that have all sorts of things included in them that shouldn't be there. And get reasonable repairs proposals, they are working with the builders and owners to get this done. I've had three or four pools settle that way in the last 3 weeks with the insurance companies, so that they are now starting to pay out a little bit. That wasn't true 6 months ago. So this is why you want to, it pays to have somebody who keeps up on their education and what's going on with this stuff to know how to properly advise the clients on what to do. Because once you jump into the lawsuit, I mean, that's a very, very slow process.
Yeah.
It takes several years to get a decision. You're going to spend a lot of money on lawyers, whether or not you get a favorable ruling or not. So you may be throwing money that you could spend on the repair away. That may be what you need to do in some cases, but if you can work towards repair prior to litigation, I would advise trying that route. If it doesn't work, then you may have to look at litigation.
That is great advice, and this has been great insight. So again, John, thank you so much. John McIntyre from McIntyre and McIntyre Incorporated in Austin, Texas. Again, they are architectural and engineering consultants that specialize in all things aquatic. So if you need anything else, please let us, the NPC, or John and his firm know. And John, thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic. Very helpful.
It was fun, and I'm glad to have been here.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. This flew by. This is a quick hour. So, All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much, and we'll see you again on the next episode of Smooth Finish.